The radio crackled with static, then silence. Controllers at forward operating base Rhino stared at their screens as the transponder signal vanished somewhere over the Helmand River Valley. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Reeves leaned forward, coffee forgotten, watching the empty space where an Ah-64 Apache should have been. 3 minutes of dead air. In combat aviation, 3 minutes was an eternity. The last transmission had been routine: altitude check, heading confirmation, estimated time to patrol zone. Then nothing. The kind of nothing that made experienced officers reach for whiskey they kept locked in desk drawers. Outside, the Afghan sun hammered down on tarmac and dust, turning everything the color of old bone. Reeves knew the pilot flying that Apache. Everyone did. Captain Nix Valkyrin, call sign Revenant. A name she'd earned in circumstances nobody talked about but everyone remembered. She'd been flying combat missions since she was 23, back when half the brass still thought women in attack helicopters was a diversity checkbox rather than a tactical advantage. Now she was 31, with more flight hours in hostile territory than most squadron commanders, and she just disappeared off every screen in the operations center. The silence stretched. Junior officers exchanged glances. Someone muttered about mechanical failure, about the Apache's reputation for reliability, about how Valkyrin probably just had a radio malfunction. But Reeves saw the truth in their eyes, the same truth that made his chest tight. They were preparing for the worst. Preparing for the somber phone calls, the folded flag, the empty chair in the ready room. He'd made those calls before. He'd folded those flags. The memory tasted like copper and regret. Then the radio burst to life with a sound that made every head snap up. Laughter. Low, controlled, almost musical, cutting through the static like a knife through silk. Valkyrin's voice followed, calm as Sunday morning. Rhino actual Revenant, scratch 8 hostiles, I'm still working. The operations center erupted. Not with cheers, combat operations centers don't cheer, but with the controlled chaos of professionals realizing their pilot wasn't dead, wasn't captured, wasn't burning in a canyon somewhere. She was hunting, and she was winning. Reeves grabbed his headset. Revenant, Rhino actual, sitrep, now. There was a pause filled with the distant thump of rotor blades and something else, the unmistakable chatter of 30mm cannon fire. When Valkyrin spoke again, her voice carried that edge of absolute focus that separated good pilots from legends. Rhino, I have 11 remaining hostiles attempting tactical withdrawal from position Gamma 7. They walked into an ambush. Their ambush. Then I introduced myself properly. Another burst of cannon fire punctuated her words. Make that 10. The Taliban fighters had been waiting in the narrow valley, RPGs positioned, heavy machine guns zeroed on the flight path every coalition helicopter used. They'd planned it perfectly, studied the patterns, calculated the angles. They knew exactly when an Apache would come. They knew exactly where it would fly. What they didn't know was that Revenant had been flying these mountains since before some of them could walk. She'd seen the intelligence reports 3 days earlier. Increased radio chatter near Checkpoint Serpent, unusual civilian evacuations from 2 villages, fresh tire tracks where no vehicles should be. The pieces formed a picture that headquarters dismissed as speculative. But Valkyrin had learned to trust patterns, to read the landscape like a book written in dust and danger. So she changed her route, dropped altitude where doctrine said climb, and come at the valley from the north instead of the east. When the ambush triggered, she wasn't where they'd aimed their weapons. She was behind them, above them, inside their decision cycle before they realized the game had changed. The Apache banked hard, instrument panel glowing in the late afternoon light. Valkyrin's hands moved across controls with the fluid precision of someone who'd performed these actions 10,000 times. Beside her, Warrant Officer James Cortez managed weapons systems, his voice steady on the internal comms. Target lock, 11 o'clock, range 400 meters. She barely nodded, eyes scanning the terrain through the helmet-mounted display. The landscape rendered in thermal whites and greens, human shapes moving between rocks like ghosts trying to find cover that didn't exist anymore. Confirmed. Light them up. The M230 chain gun sang its metallic song. 30mm rounds walked across the mountainside at 625 rounds per minute, each impact throwing up plumes of dust and rock. The Taliban fighters scattered, their carefully planned ambush dissolving into chaos. Some tried to return fire. Tracers arced up toward the Apache, beautiful and deadly, falling short as Valkyrin adjusted altitude with minimal control inputs. She'd been shot at so many times it registered more as data than danger, trajectory, velocity, threat assessment. All filed away in the back of her mind while the front focused on the next target, the next decision, the next 3 seconds that determined who lived and who didn't. Back at Rhino, Reeves listened to the engagement unfold with the detached fascination of someone watching a master at work. Other pilots were good. Some were excellent. But Valkyrin operated on a different level entirely, where instinct and training merged into something that looked like prescience. She anticipated movements before they happened, positioned the Apache where it needed to be before logic said it was possible. 5 years ago, when she'd first arrived in theater, he'd been skeptical. The Pentagon had been pushing integration hard, and cynical field officers saw politics more than capability. Then he'd watched her fly. The call sign, Revenant, hadn't been a gift. It had been earned in blood and fire over Kandahar province during a mission that should have been routine. She'd been flying escort for a medevac convoy when insurgents hit them with a coordinated assault. RPGs, small arms, everything they had. Her wingman took a rocket to the tail rotor, auto-rotated down hard but survived. Valkyrin had circled back, alone, against doctrine and orders and held position over the downed Apache for 40 minutes while reinforcements fought their way through. She'd taken 17 hits. The Apache had limped back to base streaming hydraulic fluid and barely controllable. When maintenance crews saw the damage, they couldn't believe she'd kept it in the air. When they pulled her from the cockpit, her hands were still steady. Someone said she'd come back from the dead to protect her wingman. The name stuck. So did the respect, grudging at first, then absolute. Now that respect rippled through the operations center as they listened to her systematically dismantle an ambush that should have killed her. Junior officers who'd questioned their assignments, who'd wondered why they were taking orders from someone who didn't fit their preconceptions, were learning a lesson that couldn't be taught in classrooms. Combat didn't care about politics. It cared about competence. And competence, real competence, transcended everything else. Valkyrin's voice came through again, still calm, still controlled. Rhino, Revenant. 6 hostiles remaining, attempting exfil via the North Ridge. Request artillery support, grid November Whiskey 37482. Reeves glanced at the fire support coordinator, who nodded and started making calls. Within 90 seconds, a battery of M777 howitzers 12 kilometers away adjusted their aim. The mathematical precision of modern warfare, coordinates transmitted digitally, fire missions calculated by computers that didn't care about fear or fatigue. Revenant, artillery inbound 30 seconds, clear the zone. Valkyrin banked the Apache hard right, gaining altitude and distance. Through her display, she watched the Taliban fighters scrambling up the ridge, desperate now, abandoning equipment in their rush to escape. Some part of her understood their panic. They'd set the perfect trap and somehow found themselves inside it instead. But understanding didn't mean mercy. War had taught her that mercy in the moment often just meant more dead Americans later. Compassion came after, in the quiet hours, in the questions that had no good answers. During, there was only the mission. The artillery rounds screamed down from the sky like the fist of an angry god. The ridge erupted in sequential blooms of fire and shrapnel, each explosion precise and devastating. When the smoke cleared, nothing moved in the impact zone. Valkyrin circled once, confirming professional to the end. Rhino, Revenant, zone is clear. All hostiles neutralized, returning to base. Her voice carried no triumph, no excitement. Just the flat acknowledgement of work completed. The flight back took 40 minutes, the Apache's shadow racing across empty desert and scattered villages. Valkyrin used the time to decompress, letting the adrenaline bleed away slowly. Cortez was quiet in the back seat, running post-engagement checks, his presence a steady comfort. They'd flown together for 2 years now, developed the wordless communication that good crews had. He trusted her to bring them home. She trusted him to watch her back. In a machine designed for violence, that trust was the only soft thing allowed. She thought about the ambush as she flew, analyzing it clinically. They'd been well-positioned, patient, disciplined. A year ago, that ambush might have worked. But insurgents made the mistake of thinking tactics were static, that what worked before would work again. They didn't adapt fast enough. Didn't realize that the pilots they were fighting had been adapting for 20 years, evolving tactics in real time, learning from every engagement, every close call, every friend who didn't come home. The Americans weren't better because of superior equipment, though that helped. They were better because they learned faster and adapted harder. As the base came into view, Valkyrin allowed herself a small smile. Not about the kills. Those never brought satisfaction, just the grim knowledge that 14 mothers somewhere would be mourning sons. But about the fact that her instincts had been right, that changing the route had saved her life and Cortez's life, and that somewhere in the valley, an American patrol would move through safely tomorrow because the ambush wasn't there anymore. Small victories. That's what this war was made of. Small victories and long memories. The Apache touched down with barely a shudder, hydraulics hissing as weight transferred to landing gear. Ground crews rushed forward, already assessing the damage. Valkyrin saw the bullet holes stitched across the tail boom, 7, 8, maybe 9 rounds that had found their mark. The Apache was tough, built to absorb punishment, but seeing the damage always sent a cold spike through her chest. Inches. The difference between alive and dead often came down to inches. She went through shutdown procedures with practiced efficiency, each switch flipped in the correct sequence, each system powered down properly. Discipline didn't end when the shooting stopped. The pilots who got sloppy on the ground were the ones who made mistakes in the air. When the rotors finally stopped spinning, the sudden silence felt heavy, almost oppressive. Inside the helmet, inside the machine, there was always noise, engines, rotors, radio chatter, the howl of wind over armored glass. Outside, just the Afghan evening, and the distant sound of generators. Reeves was waiting on the tarmac when she climbed down, his expression unreadable in the fading light. Valkyrin pulled off her helmet, dark hair plastered to her skull with sweat, and met his gaze without flinching. She knew that look, had seen it on superior officers' faces before. The one that meant questions, debriefs, probably some gentle inquiry about whether she'd exceeded her authority by changing her flight plan without clearance. She was ready to defend her decisions. She was always ready. But Reeves surprised her. He extended his hand, and when she took it, his grip was firm and warm. "Hell of a day's work, Captain." His voice carried across the tarmac, loud enough for the ground crews to hear, for the other pilots standing near the ready room to hear. Public acknowledgement. From a lieutenant colonel who didn't give compliments lightly, it meant something. Meant more than she wanted to admit. "Just flying my route, sir." She kept her voice neutral, professional, but something loosened in her chest. The constant low-grade tension of being watched, judged, measured against standards that shifted depending on who was watching. It eased just slightly. Reeves smiled, a rare expression that made him look 10 years younger. "Your route, right. The one that just happened to put you in perfect position to intercept an ambush that intelligence said didn't exist." He shook his head slowly, still smiling. "We'll debrief in 30 minutes. Get cleaned up, get some food, and Valkyrin," she paused, halfway to the ready room. "Trust your instincts. They're better than our satellites." It was perhaps the highest compliment she'd ever received from a field-grade officer. Instincts. In a military culture that worshipped procedures and doctrine, being told to trust gut feelings was tantamount to being handed the keys to the kingdom. It meant he saw her not as a policy experiment or a checkbox, but as a warrior who understood war in ways that couldn't be quantified or taught. The debriefing was thorough but not hostile. Intelligence officers wanted details about enemy positions, numbers, equipment. Tactics officers wanted her exact flight path, decision points, weapon employment. Reeves wanted to understand how she'd known, what specific indicators had made her change course. She answered everything honestly, walking them through her thought process, the pattern recognition that had screamed ambush even when the data was incomplete. Some of them got it. Others looked skeptical, still wanting everything reduced to spreadsheets and probability matrices. But they all listened. That was new. 3 years ago, they would have interrupted, dismissed, second-guessed. Now they took notes. When it finally ended, she walked to the chow hall under stars that looked nothing like home. Afghanistan's night sky was spectacular in its clarity, unpolluted by city lights, vast and cold and indifferent. She thought about the men she'd killed today, wondered if any of them had looked at these same stars last night, wondered if they'd known it was their last time. The thoughts came unbidden, unwelcome. She'd learned not to push them away. Suppression just made them stronger. Better to acknowledge, file away, and keep moving. Survival mechanism. Psychological armor that was just as important as the physical kind. The chow hall was half empty, late enough that most soldiers had already eaten. She grabbed a tray of something allegedly chicken, found a corner table, and ate mechanically. Food was fuel, nothing more. Taste barely registered. She was thinking about tomorrow's mission, next week's missions, the long chain of days that stretched ahead until her deployment ended and she rotated home. Home. The word felt strange now, abstract. She'd been in Afghanistan for 8 months this rotation, her third deployment. More time in combat zones than in the States over the past 5 years. Home had become a concept rather than a place. Mind if I sit? She looked up. Captain David Akoy, call sign Nomad, one of the other Apache pilots. Good guy, solid pilot, never gave her grief about being a woman in a community that was still adjusting. She gestured to the empty chair and he sat, his own tray loaded with enough food for 2 people. He was built like he'd played college football, which he had, linebacker at Ohio State before the Army made him a better offer. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before he spoke. Heard about your engagement. Whole base is talking. She grimaced slightly. Attention made her uncomfortable, always had. She flew because she loved flying, because the Apache was the most honest thing in her life. Respond to inputs correctly and it would keep you alive, screw up and it would kill you. Simple. Fair. The politics around flying, the scrutiny, the constant awareness of being a symbol whether she wanted to be or not, that part she could do without. Just another day, she said, pushing rice around her plate. Akoy laughed, a deep rumbling sound. Yeah, except most days don't involve single-handedly dismantling an entire insurgent cell that was trying to kill you. But sure, just another day. He leaned forward, voice dropping. They're scared of you, you know. The Taliban. Got chatter intercepts saying there's a death bird that hunts at dusk, that their ambushes fail because the Americans have a demon pilot who sees everything. She looked up sharply, surprised. He nodded. Intel briefed us yesterday. Your call sign is showing up in their radio traffic. In Pashto, they call you Wayle the Ghost. They think you're supernatural. Something cold moved through her chest. Being feared by the enemy was a tactical advantage, yes, but being turned into a legend felt dangerous in ways she couldn't articulate. Legends attracted attention. Attention attracted politics. Politics destroyed careers and got people killed. She'd worked so hard to just be competent, to be so good they couldn't dismiss her, to prove that she belonged in the cockpit not because of what she represented but because of what she could do. And now she was becoming a ghost story. Great, she muttered, just what I needed, a reputation. Akoy's expression turned serious. No, what you needed was respect, and you've got it now. The brass respects you. The ground pounders respect you. Hell, even the enemy respects you. That's not nothing, Nix, that's everything. He used her first name, rare in military culture, a deliberate intimacy that made the words hit harder. I've been flying combat for 6 years. I've seen a lot of pilots come through. Some are good, some are great. You're something else, something better, don't run from that. She met his eyes, searching for irony or mockery or the subtle condescension she'd learned to detect. Found none, just honesty and something that might have been awe. It unnerved her more than enemy fire. Bullets she understood. This admiration from peers she respected, this was uncharted territory. She'd spent so long fighting to be taken seriously that acceptance, when it came, felt like a trap. They finished eating and walked out into the Afghan night. The base hummed with activity, generators, distant conversations, the whine of jet engines from the fighter squadron on the far side of the airfield. Somewhere, a radio played country music, the sound tinny and out of place. Valkyrin breathed deep, tasting dust and jet fuel and the peculiar smell of a combat base at war. Tomorrow she'd fly again. The day after, same, until her rotation ended or until her luck ran out. That was the calculus of combat aviation. Every pilot knew it. Every pilot accepted it. The ones who couldn't, washed out or transferred or found reasons to stay on the ground. She thought about her father as she walked. Colonel Richard Valkyrin, Air Force, retired. He'd flown F-16s in Desert Storm, come home with medals and nightmares he'd never discussed. She'd grown up watching him stare at the sky with an expression of mingled longing and dread, as if the clouds held answers to questions he couldn't voice. When she told him she wanted to fly, wanted to join the army and become a helicopter pilot, his face had gone carefully blank. Then he'd nodded once and said, "Make sure you're better than everyone else, because they'll be watching, waiting for you to fail. Don't give them the satisfaction." She'd taken that advice seriously. Flight school at Fort Rucker, she'd been top of her class. Gunnery training, top scores. Tactical courses, perfect evaluations. Better than everyone else, just like he'd said. It still hadn't been enough for some people. There were officers who looked at her and saw a political statement, a Pentagon diversity initiative, anything except a pilot who could do the job. So she'd kept being better, kept proving herself mission after mission, until the evidence was overwhelming and the skeptics had to either admit they were wrong or look like idiots. The ghost story, though, that was unexpected, that was new territory. She wasn't sure how to handle becoming a legend while still trying to just be a soldier. But as she walked through the dark Afghan night toward her quarters, she decided it didn't matter. She'd keep flying the way she'd always flown, smart, aggressive, adapting to every situation. Let the Taliban fear her. Let the brass admire her. Let her fellow pilots respect her. She'd stay focused on the only thing that really mattered, bringing her crew home alive every single day. Sleep came hard that night like it always did after combat. Her mind replayed the engagement in endless loops, analyzing each decision, second-guessing herself even though the outcome had been successful. Could she have positioned the Apache better? Should she have called for backup earlier? The questions spiraled, unanswerable, exhausting. Around midnight she gave up, pulled on PT gear and went to the gym. The base gym was a converted storage building, cramped and hot even at night, but it had weights and a treadmill and most importantly, it was empty at this hour. She ran for an hour, pushing herself until her legs burned and her lungs screamed and her mind finally, mercifully, went quiet. The rhythm of footfalls, the mechanical whir of the treadmill, the sweat dripping onto already stained rubber, these things were real, immediate, simple. In a world of complex moral calculus and impossible decisions, physical exhaustion offered the only honest form of peace. When she finally stopped, gasping, her shirt soaked through, she felt almost human again. Almost normal. She showered in the empty communal bathroom, stood under lukewarm water until it started to run cold, then dragged herself back to her quarters and fell into bed. This time, sleep came like a hammer, dark and complete and mercifully dreamless. The alarm woke her at 500. She dressed by muscle memory, brain still booting up, and stumbled to the chow hall for coffee that could strip paint and breakfast that came from bags and tins. Other pilots filtered in gradually, the early morning crowd of people who lived by flight schedules and mission timelines. The conversations were muted, professional. Nomad raised his mug in greeting. She nodded back, too tired for words. Outside, the sky was starting to lighten, that pre-dawn purple that preceded the brutal Afghan sunrise. Pre-flight briefing at 600 in the operations center. Reeves laid out the day's missions, patrol routes, support for ground units, reconnaissance over suspected enemy positions. Standard counterinsurgency operations, the kind that had defined this war for 2 decades. When he reached Valkyrin's assignment, he paused. "Revenant, you're escorting a convoy through the Tangi Valley." A few pilots shifted uncomfortably. The Tangi Valley had a reputation: narrow, winding, perfect ambush terrain. It's where a Chinook had been shot down years earlier, killing 30 American service members in the single deadliest day of the war. Everyone knew the name. Everyone knew the history. "I want you on this specifically because of yesterday," Reeves continued, his eyes locked on hers. "Intelligence thinks the insurgents might try again. Different location, same tactics. If anyone can read the situation and adapt in real time, it's you." It wasn't a compliment. It was an assignment given because she was the best option for a dangerous mission. But coming from Reeves, that meant more than empty praise. It meant trust. She nodded, already thinking through the approach, the angles, the places an RPG team might position themselves. "Understood, sir, time hack." He glanced at his watch. "Convoy departs at 900. You'll provide aerial overwatch for the duration. 3 hours. Enough time to pre-flight the Apache properly, to brief with Cortez, to prepare mentally for another day of flying into places where people wanted to kill her. Standard operating procedure. Just another day at the office. If your office was a multi-million-dollar attack helicopter, and your job was violence managed with precision." Pre-flight inspection took an hour. She walked around the Apache slowly, checking every panel, every fastener, every system. The bullet holes from yesterday had been patched, but she could see where the armor had stopped rounds meant for her. The Apache could take incredible punishment, but she never took it for granted. Machines failed. Metal fatigued. Complacency killed. So she checked everything twice, then climbed into the cockpit and ran through the startup sequence while Cortez did the same in the back seat. The turbines spooled up with their characteristic whine, building to a roar as the rotors began to turn. The Apache shook, vibrated, came alive around her. This feeling of systems coming online, of taking command of a machine designed for exactly one purpose, this was home in ways that no physical location could ever be. At 8:45 they lifted off, banking toward the Tangi Valley. Below, the convoy assembled, 8 vehicles, mix of MRAPs and Humvees, carrying supplies and personnel to a forward operating base. Her job was to fly ahead, identify threats, and eliminate them before they became problems. Simple in concept, complex in execution, requiring constant vigilance and decision-making at speeds that left no room for doubt. She loved it and hated it in equal measure, the way you could love something that might kill you at any moment. The valley appeared ahead, a brown scar cutting through brown mountains under a sky so blue it hurt to look at, beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. She dropped altitude, began the first sweep. Her eyes moved constantly, scanning ridgelines for movement, watching for the glint of metal or glass that might indicate a sniper position, looking for anything out of place in a landscape she'd memorized through dozens of previous flights. The helmet-mounted display fed her data: altitude, speed, fuel state, weapon status. But the real information came from her eyes and the instincts she'd honed over thousands of flight hours. Something didn't look right about the northern ridge. Couldn't say what exactly. Just a feeling, a discordance that triggered alarms in her hindbrain. She circled, studying it. There, fresh tire tracks leading to a cluster of boulders where there shouldn't be vehicle access. She marked the position, zoomed the targeting camera. Movement, brief, just someone shifting position, but enough. Cortez marked target 11 o'clock, range 800 meters. His response was immediate. "Marked. I count 3, no, 4 individuals, definitely armed." The protocol was clear. Observe, identify, engage only if hostile action was imminent. But the tire tracks, the positioning, the fact that they were exactly where an RPG team would set up to hit a convoy, it added up to a picture she'd seen too many times before. She got on the radio. "Ground element, Revenant. I have eyes on possible hostile position. North Ridge, grid November Whiskey 37558. Recommend you hold position while I investigate." The convoy commander's voice came back, tense but controlled. "Revenant ground element copies, standing by." She brought the Apache around, aggressive, making sure anyone watching knew they'd been spotted. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes just showing up made the enemy pack up and leave, deciding that whatever ambush they'd planned wasn't worth dying for. But sometimes it didn't. Sometimes they were committed or fanatic or stupid enough to think they could win. She watched the position through the camera, waiting to see which way it would go. One of the figures raised something to his shoulder. The distinctive profile of an RPG launcher, unmistakable even at this distance. Decision time. Cortex hostile with RPG, permission to engage. Cortez's voice was steady, professional. Confirmed hostile threat. You are cleared hot. The cannon spoke its truth in bursts of 30mm thunder. The ridge erupted in dust and fire, the carefully planned ambush site turning into a killing ground in the span of 3 seconds. She didn't watch the impacts, already scanning for secondary positions, for the survivors who might still pose a threat. Found one running south along the ridge line and put a burst ahead of him. He dropped. She circled again, methodical, clearing the entire area before keying the radio. Ground element, Revenant, threat neutralized, your route is clear. There was a pause, then the convoy commander's voice, carrying relief he'd probably deny later. Revenant, ground element, thanks for the save, moving now. She watched them roll through the valley, vulnerable and exposed but alive because she'd been there, seen the threat, responded in time. 4 more insurgents who'd woken up this morning planning to kill Americans and wouldn't see sunset. She felt nothing about it. No satisfaction, no remorse. Just the flat acknowledgement of work done correctly. Mathematics written in blood. Equations that always balanced, one way or another. The convoy made it through without incident. She escorted them the entire route, another hour of flying circles over vehicles that looked like toys from altitude, knowing that inside them were soldiers who were depending on her to keep them safe. The responsibility was crushing if you thought about it too much. So she didn't. She just flew, watched, stayed alert. When they reached their destination and she peeled off to return to base, the convoy commander's voice came through one last time. Revenant, ground element actual. Don't know what we did to deserve you up there, but we're buying the first round when we get back to the world. She smiled despite herself. Copy that, ground element. Stay safe. The flight back was uneventful, which was the best kind of flight. She landed at 12:30, shut down, and went through the same post-flight routine she performed hundreds of times. Cortez climbed out first, stretching, and waited while she finished her checks. When she finally dismounted, he was grinning. 2 days, 8 kills, 1 convoy saved. You're making the rest of us look bad, she snorted. Team effort, Cortez. I just drive. You make the weapons work. He shook his head. Yeah, well, your driving seems to keep putting us in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Starting to think maybe that ghost story isn't entirely bullshit. The rest of the day passed in the routine of military life. Paperwork, maintenance briefings, a quick workout, dinner in the chow hall where she noticed more people nodding to her, acknowledging her presence in ways they hadn't before. Word was spreading. 2 successful engagements in 2 days, both against prepared ambushes, both ending with enemy casualties and 0 friendly losses. In a war defined by frustration and ambiguity, clear wins like that mattered. They gave people something concrete to point to, proof that training and skill and experience could still make a difference. That evening she got summoned to Reeves' office. She knocked, entered at his command, and found him sitting behind a desk covered in maps and intelligence reports. He gestured to a chair and she sat, wondering what this was about. He studied her for a moment, expression thoughtful, then slid a folder across the desk. Read that. She opened it. After-action reports from her last 2 engagements, plus intelligence summaries showing the impact those operations had on enemy activity in the region. Radio intercepts mentioning her call sign, discussing her tactics, debating whether she was human or something else. The folder painted a picture of an enemy force that was starting to adjust their behavior based on her presence, avoiding areas she patrolled, canceling operations when intelligence suggested she might be airborne, fear as a force multiplier. She looked up. Reeves was watching her carefully. You're becoming a problem for them, he said. A big enough problem that they're changing their tactics. That's rare, that's valuable, he paused. It also makes you a priority target. If they get a chance to shoot you down, they'll take it. Doesn't matter the cost. She'd expected this conversation at some point. Success bred attention and attention bred danger. Understood, sir. What are you recommending? He leaned back in his chair, considering. Honestly, I'm recommending you keep doing exactly what you're doing. You're saving lives, Valkyrin, American lives, coalition lives. The risk to you is significant, yes, but the value you're providing is greater. As long as you're comfortable continuing, I want you in the air. It wasn't an order. It was a choice. She appreciated that. Appreciated being given agency, being trusted to assess her own risk tolerance. Some commanders would have made the decision for her, either pulling her off flight status to protect a valuable asset or pushing her forward regardless of the danger. Reeves was giving her the call. She thought about her father, about his stories of air combat over Iraq, about the weight of flying missions where people shot at you, and sometimes their bullets found their mark. She thought about the soldiers in the convoy today who'd gone home to their families, eventually because she'd been there. She thought about Cortez, who trusted her to keep them both alive. And she thought about herself, about the person who decided years ago that this was worth doing, worth the fear and the danger and the nightmares. That person was still here, still committed. I'm comfortable, sir. I'll keep flying. Reeves nodded slowly, something like respect flickering in his eyes. Good, because we need you up there. Just promise me you'll stay smart. No unnecessary risks. Your instincts are phenomenal, but they're not infallible. She smiled slightly. My instincts have kept me alive this long, sir. I'm not about to stop trusting them now. He returned the smile. Fair enough. Dismissed. She stood, saluted, and left his office feeling the weight of the conversation. Priority target. They'd be hunting her now specifically. Setting up ambushes designed not just to kill any American helicopter but to kill her Apache, her crew. It should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like validation. She'd become good enough, dangerous enough, that the enemy wanted her dead above all others. In the twisted logic of war, that meant she was winning. That night she wrote an email to her father. Didn't mention the missions, the kills, the danger. Just told him she was flying, that she was okay, that the Apache was everything he'd said it would be and more. Told him she finally understood why he'd kept flying even after the nightmares started, why he'd never been fully present at home because part of him was always in the sky, always flying, always hunting. She understood now. Understood that some things got into your blood and stayed there, became part of your identity in ways you couldn't explain to people who'd never experienced it. She hit send and hoped he'd read between the lines, hoped he'd know she was telling him she'd found her place in the world even if that place was violent and dangerous and thousands of miles from anything that looked like home. The next morning brought orders for a new mission. High-value target, suspected Taliban commander, intelligence indicating he'd be moving through a specific area at a specific time. Time-sensitive strike mission, Apache plus a team of special operations soldiers in Blackhawks. Her job, provide cover during insertion, eliminate any threats that emerged, and extract the team after they'd completed their objective. Complex, dangerous, exactly the kind of mission that required pilots who could think 3 steps ahead and adapt when the plan inevitably fell apart. She was briefed at 400, wheels up at 500, flying into darkness with night vision turning the world into shades of green and black. The Blackhawks were shadows ahead of her, flying nap of the earth through valleys and around mountains, staying below radar coverage, invisible to anyone without eyes directly on them. She flew cover, higher and offset, scanning for threats, ready to rain fire on anything that moved wrong. The insertion went smooth. Blackhawks flared into a landing zone, special operations soldiers spilled out.